Hello, everybody. First, let me apologize. Mother Nature obviously took very personally something that Houston did, because if you saw the path of the tropical storm, it wasn't really a path. It was more like a bullseye just on Houston and the surrounding area. And so my morning yesterday that was beautifully designed to go to the airport and get on a plane and head back to North Carolina to be able to be with you, was slightly changed when about 6 cars in front of the shuttle bus, the road shut down due to flooding. And for the next 5 hours, me and my new best friends on the bus sat still on said shuttle bus, waiting for the storm to pass and hoping that all would be well. So not what was planned. But I was very excited to realize that we had an option for virtual presentation and conversations today. I very much want to be able to speak with you and answer questions as they come up. So bear with us through the technology glitches, but we will have windows of time throughout the morning where we will break for Q&A, and you are welcome to utilize the chat. I don't have visibility of the chat in the view that I have currently, but other folks on the ground there will be monitoring that so we can make sure that any chat questions come forward. Excellent. Okay, so getting us started for the morning. This is part of this presentation, to be more accurate, part of this presentation I shared at the Summer SAC COC Data and Assessment Institute. And that is as terribly exciting as it sounds. And it's really an interesting platform because it's the time in the year when the data analysts and the IE folks come together with instructional folks and try to translate between those two realms. So the first part of the presentation today to visit with you has to do with how do we approach assessment. Some of you in the room may be instructional leaders. That may be a department chair, a lead faculty of some sort, an unofficial mentor of others, or dean or VPI. However, all of you are instructional leaders in that you message and make choices every day as to how do we communicate to our students, with our students, and for our students, all of their aspects of learning. So we'll talk about that from that perspective a little bit, and then we'll spend some time talking specifically about learning outcomes and why it is that this trend has picked up in higher education and what that can mean for us. So you have, you've been shared my brief bio, not to drill down on any of these things, but just to give you a couple pieces that give context to my experiences. Odessa College is about 7,000 students, and it's out in West Texas. Unfortunately, Odessa is the home of one of the recent mass shooting events, and many of my friends and colleagues were impacted through that tragedy. It is a very tightly knit community between Odessa and Midland because around those two cities, there's about a 2-hour radius of virtually nothing. It really is, the Permian Basin is a very no man's land type of realm. And so when you think about college going culture, when you think about areas that really nurture the multi-generational college tradition, that is not the Permian Basin. And that area has about a 13 to 16% baccalaureate attainment rate. So when we look at the student learning accomplishments that were shared with you, that's really relevant because that was against all odds. There weren't and continue not to be demographic trends that make that easy. And very often when we hear about transformational works, one of our first reactions may be, well, yes, but that's because X. And if they had Y like we had, then it would be different. And part of the messaging is we all have, every single one of the 1,100 plus community colleges, we all have the challenges that are unique to our demographic, unique to our economy. And so the work that we will be talking about today is about how do we reach and connect with students in spite of those. So it's not that those are not real, they are very real, but how do we do our work with the most effectiveness for our students in spite of those challenges? My recent move to Houston comes with a slight change in size, as Lone Star College serves over 90,000 credit students across 7 campuses. The largest campus is Cy-Fair, and that one campus serves 23,000 students. So now the challenge is, how do we take these various initiatives, perspectives, ways of thinking about learning, and do that on a significant scale, a scale that is larger than the enrollment of some states. Because for me, this work and the importance of these conversations really does stem from the idea that higher education is able to be a transformative point for individuals, families, and the nation. And so that's a huge responsibility for us to figure out, how do we really do it well? Because if we believe that the students that come through our doors deserve that opportunity, then it's incumbent on us to figure out, but how do we do it in spite of the challenges that face each college and each student? This will drive those of you who teach how to build PowerPoints absolutely insane. I apologize for that moment of madness. I have full awareness that this is a slide of chaos, and that's partially on purpose. The work that we can trigger by way of looking at higher education, looking at community colleges through the lens of student learning, can become quite chaotic, can become quite busy, because there's so many overlapping pieces that then go into making the changes that help us help our students. But it's worth the work, it's worth the trials, it's worth a little bit of chaos and a lot of discomfort at times, because what you see in front of you are some of the changes just in the data snapshot for students at Odessa College as a result of this very intentional work. And the persistence rates that are on the vertical bars on the side of your screen, those persistence rates, as broken down by demographic, illustrate the demographic patterns that follow the drop rates, the success rates. And that is that those students who statistically are most at need of excellence from us benefit most from the work that we're going to talk about. But it is solid learning practices. They are solid learning focus for all students. And so regardless of where a demographic or an individual started on the continuum, they are able to improve from that point. And we remind ourselves that every single one of these data points represents real people with real families and real experiences that prior to coming into your classrooms may have instead reinforced for them that they weren't good enough, that higher education really isn't meant for their space, that they're overreaching what they're supposed to go after. And you have the ability every day in how you structure your institution and how you structure your courses to counter that message and reaffirm that, yes, this is their space and that we're in this learning experience together. Many of us in the room have said to others or to ourselves, well, what we need to do is figure out, how do we get buy-in? How do we convince the students, or how do we convince the faculty, or how do we convince all of the employees to buy into this idea? And I would like to propose that it's not that we need buy-in when we inspire and when we come from a point of ignition that this is our passion, then we're in a position to have people choose and want to be part of that inspirational movement. So it really starts with us and how we think about and then how we articulate the work that we're doing. So I would highlight at this time that whenever an initiative comes forward, or whenever a change comes forward, or whenever an expectation or requirement comes forward, human nature is that we ask why. I think for many small children, it's at least in the top 5 of first words that they learn. And those of you who have had 2- and 3-year-olds, the perpetual why is a very early question. And we joke about 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds in that window. But when we stop to think about it, it really calls attention to the fact that at our core being, we're curious and we want to understand and we want to know the meaning and the reason and the logic and the rationale behind things. And so sometimes as parents or as leaders or as managers, sometimes we default to an answer that is an authority answer. It's true, but it doesn't hit to the inspiration. And one example in this context when it comes to assessments, well, because SAC said so. And you may have heard that in recent years. Most of us in institutions point that out as we're approaching reaffirmation. And then the danger is, as you come through reaffirmation, as you all did so well, then for the next 8 years, but why do we have to do it? And the drive of, well, because SACS is going to come back and because we're going to have to show it at 5 years and all of those things isn't a motivation in long days and difficult days to do the real meaningful work behind this collection. And so I would challenge us, and I've had to challenge myself as well and continue to as we have these conversations at Lone Star, that is true. And that is an important awareness for us to have. But it can't be the only why that we have on our radar. So sometimes we get a little bit more broad and we say, well, because we have to. And again, we're not yet hitting into why should I want to? Why should I be excited about it? Why should I put the work into it? And probably the one we least like to hear is because you have to, right? So someone else has come up with work that someone else has to do. And that is not, that's not an exciting awareness for any of us at any level. So I would challenge us to rethink and explore our why. I do have visual of many of you in the room. So quick show of hands, who here has heard of Simon Sinek? Okay, awesome, thank you. I do have a couple hands. So this slide and I think the next one also give you a couple resources to explore if this is an area that you find of interest. But Simon Sinek talks about the golden circle, and that's illustrated by the why, how, what circle on your screen. Not to go into the full TED Talk, but I highly recommend that you take a look at what he has online. What he's done is to look at the corporate business world and to say there's a big difference in companies that have products like computer products and how people respond to those objects and who becomes a mega company with huge popularity and cult-like following and who doesn't, who withers and kind of moves on. And what he recognizes in that is that what most of us do, what most companies do in that context is start with the rational and logical explanation for the benefits of their product. What is it that it can do for you better than competitors or better than what you may have had in the past? And so through that logic and rationale, the hope is that folks buy into that and then purchase the object. That doesn't explain then some of the obsessive following that we have for companies like Google or Apple. And what he realizes is that those companies can have an entire advertisement campaign where they never actually really show the product much or talk about what it is and does. What they instead do is connect with the identity, the feelings, the emotions, the passions of the audience. And if if through advertising and marketing, we can express how we are like this, and those people who want to also be this type of person, maybe that's a champion, maybe that's a star athlete, maybe that is the most popular person in the room, maybe that is the transformative environmentalist, whatever that identity is, if we can connect to that, then any product that comes out will be able to have much longer lasting connection. And so what I would argue then is that if we think about learning and instructional transformation from that same perspective, then we instead have to think about our why. Why is it that we're in education? Why is it that we're here in the business, quote unquote, of learning? And what is it that we are able to find as that anchor, as that core, as that heart of our identity for us as we go through the hard work and the heavy lift and the emotionally taxing work that is our world. So a quick, again, slide of some resources. These are folks that talk about this in the context outside of the realm of education, but that I find really helpful for framing up the work that we do. Often we operate in relatively niched silos. And so if you haven't had a chance to read about some of these folks and the science of learning and the importance of vulnerability in leadership, then take a moment to jot these names down. I think the folks there have the PowerPoints. Again, these are just resources to think more about this work. So what I'd like you to do is take just a minute, literally, to talk at your tables about why do you work in higher education? What do you believe about higher education? So what is your why for the world that you're in? So if you would take just a minute, and I'll time us and then come back to talk at your tables about what is your why for being in higher education. Okay. So could I have a couple folks, and I know that with the logistics of the room, it may be a little bit tricky, but could a couple folks share the why that they framed for the folks at their table? What is your why?
The microphone's up here, so.
Okay. Well, and I actually figured out how to pull the chat up. So someone, or a number of folks actually can enter into the chat now their whys if they'd rather take that route.
Hey everyone, I'm Christine. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm the apprenticeship coordinator. Yes, no? Okay.
Good.
And I'm sitting with the instructors from the automotive department, and they were talking about the needs in the community and how if we weren't providing this training, if they weren't teaching these classes, then it wouldn't be happening in our community. And we've got a lot of folks retiring, and so our entire community is actually staying afloat thanks to the work that they're doing here.
Excellent. That's absolutely a piece of it, is that the skill set that you prepare students to take out into the world allows our society to continue to function in the way that it is, as well as push that cutting edge of how does it need to keep up with the technological changes. Excellent.
Hello, I'm Steve, and I'm with the business group, and we kind of gelled on a few themes. So one would be giving back to community and to students, younger generation, and also just kind of seeing folks passionate about our professions and our professional backgrounds.
Wonderful. Absolutely. So that sense of giving back, contributing on a legacy far beyond our own lifespan to that next generation. And then igniting that passion and excitement for the things that you have energy for. Excellent. One more. And I have one in the chat: genuine interest in the discipline I teach and learning mutually with students at a higher level. Absolutely. It is that joy that comes from continuing to learn yourself about the area and the discipline and the content and how other people view that and what they learn from it. We also have one, the difference we can make in the prospects of students that might not be a typical four-year college student. I think that's such an important part. We have to be advocates as community colleges because we get forgotten in the narrative of higher education also often. I know there's a lot of dialogue that goes on about, well, not everybody needs to be a college student. When that gets said, people are thinking about a very small niche of college. And instead, if we say every person has the ability to be a college student, and what college looks like, maybe their GED, what college looks like, maybe continuing education credentials, or what college looks like, maybe the applied science degrees, technical training or transfer. So when we give it that breadth of what college is, then that changes the dynamic. And then the last one I'm seeing in the comments, open access to transformational opportunities. So true. The work that you do, and as exhausted as you can be at the end of a day, that really allows for the catalyst of a multi-generational change for individuals, for families, and for entire neighborhoods. So that's really important work. I can't tell if there's anybody else up at the mic, but otherwise I'm going to move on. Is there someone else still up there? Okay, I'm going to take that as moving forward, and I'm going to have to move this chat so I can see what I'm talking about. Okay. So as was shared, this is just one way for an institution to frame its why. And hang on, there we go. The answers that we come up with as individuals can help to fuel that institutional exploration of why are we collectively, why are we together in this work and what we do. So these are, again, just some ways to think about and to frame our individual why as well as our collective why when we put all of our efforts together. So as we move forward into the learning outcomes and the assessment aspect of this, again, I would challenge you to lead from where you are. You have the flame, the passion within your purpose and your why. And so don't turn to the state, don't look to a regional accreditor, or even your own president or dean or vice president or chair. Don't look outside for someone else to tell you why you should care or why you should lead, but instead look for ways that all of those entities align with, support, or reinforce where you are pushing and driving for student excellence, for student learning, for student success. And so this really is, when we get into the logistics of some of this work, yes, it is all of those pieces. It is a thing that can be talked about this at the state level, at the regional accreditation level, and at the management and leadership level. But really the best outcomes from this work come when every one of us leads from where we are, whatever that position is, and tries to figure out, how do we own this work, and how do we make it, how do we allow it to reach its true potential for students? And so when an institution rallies around that shared why, then that's when you get the magnitude of impact that truly is possible. That is hard work, but you have the right people there with the right passion for students to be able to make that happen. And let me see, hang on, I have a visibility issue. Bear with me for just a moment. Okay. The note at the bottom of the screen, be prepared for that inquisitive why. When you lead, and it does not matter if it's the students in your classroom or it's the faculty on your instructional team, leading does not mean that folks, and leading with passion does not mean that folks don't question, why do we need to do this? Why do we need to go with this? So try to remember, even on the long days, that the questioning from the students or the questioning from your peers or your colleagues, that really comes from a desire to understand. And if we can approach our responses to that in a way that help deepen an understanding and connect with other people's why, then we're able to join that team together in a much stronger, more effective way. So take a few minutes, or take about a minute, minute and a half again this time, and let's try to use the chat feature in just a minute when I bring you back together. Explore for a moment. I was going to say the darker side. It's not so dark. It's just the reality of work world. When student learning isn't the how, isn't the front edge, the thing that we make all decisions based around. When student learning isn't that thing, what are the other variables in higher education that can supersede it? So take just a moment to talk at your table about, when student learning isn't the thing first and foremost for us in decision making, in change decisions, what is? What are the various things that can be? So talk with each other for just a minute, and feel free to use the chat as you're discussing.
Feel free to come up here and chat right here if you want. You can have that. Go ahead, feel free to come up here and chat. Okay, Valerie, some people don't quite understand that question.
Certainly. So Philip has a great example that just went into the chat: money and resources. Sometimes we make decisions in higher education with money or cost as the first variable that we factor in, and then student learning gets put second, third, fourth in that tier. And that's a very real logistics that can bump student learning from being our first priority in thinking about options, choices, decisions, etc. All right, so bringing us back together, we have a couple comments in the chat. Does anybody want to come up to the mic or go ahead and enter what thoughts your team had, your table had on this regard? Excellent. All right. So can everybody hear me all right? The chat has some great examples if you're online or someone at your table is. We've had money and resources highlighted as possibilities. Also, personal agendas or individual faculty needs and desires. That's very true. That can be as simple as, so for myself, for example, I'm not a morning person, which means starting my conversation with you this morning at 7 a.m. Texas times means I really love you. And so I might not want to teach at 8 a.m., but there's hundreds and thousands of students who need to take classes at 8 a.m. And so personal agendas or personal needs for employees or for faculty can be a variable. FTE, retention and completion, taken out of context of the student focus, but just in the math that goes into the funding models, or it really boils down to the funding models for institutions. Those things absolutely can supersede student learning at times. Bureaucracy, policies, duties, things that consume our time and energy, but don't translate into meaningful outcomes for our students. Very good, very true. Complying with state regulations and paperwork requirements. Regulations, we've always done it that way. That is so true. And it's important to recognize that we've always done it that way is a self-protective reaction that many humans have. So it doesn't mean that we're bad people. It doesn't mean that we're averse to students or we don't like each other. What it means is I have experience that the way we've done it is familiar and therefore comfortable. If you change my world, I don't have experience that necessarily says that's going to work out so well. And so there's a lot of vulnerability, and that's where Brene Brown's work comes into play. There's a lot of vulnerability that goes into being willing to change something. And the familiar discomfort is the same type of thing that keeps us in negative relationships, that keeps us doing self-destructive behaviors. So take that into an institutional or work environment, and the way we've always done it is the familiar stability of our days. But for that very reason, it won't get us that transformative outcome. Excellent. So great examples of the types of things that very realistically can supersede student learning in conversations and thinking. And so all of those things are variables. The Texas legislation session just ended, and it's a high stress window of time where all of the legislators go around and decide what all of higher education and K-12 will need to do. And that plays itself out in every state. And so the politics, the personal workload, all of these things very much can impact the focus being on student learning. So the opportunity is for this to be a time for us to refocus and say, but we want student learning to be the front of our decision making. When we identify that personal why, when we pull those together to be the heart of why we do what we do as an institution. And I would challenge us to then put student learning as our how in that next tier of the golden circle, as that everything should come through that filter first. That doesn't mean that we can commit to something down the road that we don't have the financial resources for. But if it really is an important and impactful and transformative thing for student learning, should we invest the time, resources, and thinking to try to find the financial resources for that? So it's a framing of putting that at the front of our decision-making and our operating practices. The reference to how we've always done it is a perfect segue into this. Again, I apologize for the PowerPoint folks in the room who are, again, going over the edge of, I'm sure I have a lot to learn in this work in design. But this, again, this really is, there's so much going on in education right now about rethinking what we've always done. And the circle in the middle identifies a number of different pedagogical perspectives, some of the key theorists in those areas. The Becoming a Student Ready College is a book that a lot of institutions are looking at trauma-informed pedagogy, or trauma-informed care. And tragically, that's not just from the normal ACEs of life, but that really is being tied to schools for the trauma that is unique to the violence in schools these days, as well as the trauma that comes just with our students as they have gone through life to get to our doors. And the Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, rethinking our role as bequeather of information, and recognizing that when we put students' learning first, it's so different from what can be an approach that folks individually or institutionally take. These are just some of the ways to explore, learn more, think differently about how we approach the work that we do, so that we're focusing on, well, how do I reach the students I have in front of me? Not the hypothetical student out there in the world who would be perfect, who would sit in the class and eagerly absorb the lecture as it was presented and then be prepared to answer and comply with whatever test comes at the end of that. But the real students who come with real complexity in their lives into our classrooms, and how do we think differently and approach differently this work. So just as a quick reference, how we talk to our students and how we talk about our students and how we talk about the issues really matters. And so it can be minor details. It can be things that seem very small that make a massive difference between eating your grandmother or instead having people join you at the dinner table as opposed to being the main course themselves. So how we use language really does matter. The other part of that is this is difficult work, and the blame language or the us and them language can be a default that I would challenge us to really think carefully about and try to shift to more inclusive terminology. So we often use the they, the accusatory they, and that may mean administration, it may mean the state, it may mean any number of theys, but they make us do this thing and they don't understand. And similarly in the inverse, we often use the term faculty as though by job that amorphous creation of diverse humans all thinks and behaves in the same way. And we know that's not true when we stop and pause and think about that. So really trying to use language through this process that is intentional, that is accurate, will allow us to think differently about whatever the various problems are in front of us. So when we then apply all of those framework and perspective pieces to the question of student learning, we start with the question of how do you know what students are learning? The traditional answer was by their grades. But when we stop and think about what go into grades, what are the variables that play into a student's grade on work, we realize that all of these things can have significant impact on a student's grade that in no way correlate to their learning for the course objectives or for the work that we expect them to do during their program. And so all of those variables can play in. So how do we know what students are learning? The other way that we frame our response to that is often, how do you know what students are learning? Well, I do these things. I ask them these, I give them these assignments, and I have them perform. But what we assume in that is that we're thinking about within the construct of a single course. And that's a really important awareness for us to take a moment to reflect on, that we make assumptions just from the question about what are we meaning. And so if instead, when we say, how do you know what students are learning, we're able to step back and say, throughout their entire time with you, so not just the class, there are questions that pertain to within the class, but throughout their entire time with you, which for some students is 2 years, for some students maybe 6 years, what do you want them to be learning that spans multiple classes? And that's what compels us into thinking about program learning outcomes, as opposed to the course construct, is what is it that by the time they're done with us, we want them to be proficient in, be masters of, have the skill set for. And so this is Sachs's answer to that question. And if only it were as easy as saying, oh, well, now I understand. I get it. It's all so clear and we're done. But I think for most of us, this doesn't cut it. This doesn't give us that satisfaction of insight. And so what I have for you that we'll talk through, and I've also, like I said, that's on the PowerPoint, is a reframing of that chart from Sachs, COC, as we must say, into the language of education, into the language of teachers. So we'll talk about each of these points in a minute, but all of this ultimately exists to be able to answer that question. How do we know what students are learning? And the process that we go through when thinking about student learning is reflective of the process of learning itself. So we try something, we fail at part of it, all of it. Sometimes we fail monumentally, other times we fail just at aspects and components. We reflect on that and we figure out what adjustments can we make, and then we try again. And that is part of the learning process. And so when we explain this to our students, that this is the way learning happens, then we are super excited for them and we are supportive of their process. And of course, struggling and stumbling and failing is going to be part of it, but I am here with you. It'll be good. We love it. But when that process is applied for us, we may be a wee bit more skeptical. We may be a little less eager for that fail part, and a little less sold on the try again part. Again, it's risky business, and we'd really rather just try and succeed as opposed to go through this full cycle. And so it is our time to be learners with our students. So again, when we go back to this process, breaking those things down into their steps means we start with, what is it that you expect them to know? And often we skip this step. We go right into, in the context of a class, we go right into, well, this is the textbook that I think does a really good job covering this material. Conveniently, the textbook is broken down into 14 to 16 chapters. Doesn't that work out perfectly for my weeks? And so there we go. But that's an entire book, or that's an entire collection of textbooks. What do you expect them to know? And being able to identify the heart or the core of those pieces for a course or for a program or for a certificate, what do you expect them to know can be framed through learning outcomes. As you move down then, the next is, how will they be able to show you what they learned? This is a really important part of the paradigm shift. We know that students don't come to us as a blank slate. We know that it's not about being the sage on the stage anymore in higher education, but as they say, the guide on the side, where we are facilitating their learning. And so it's not about what I tell them, it's about what they then are able to do differently after whatever that learning experience has been. So how are they going to show me that? And in the world of assessment, we refer to those as artifacts, but really that is that question. How will they be able to show you what they've learned? How well did they do each aspect of what you had hoped they learned? So holistic assessment is certainly a valuable thing to say, where do they fall kind of overall on the continuum? But then in order to improve the student's experience, the student's learning, the student's skill set, if we're able to break that down and say, well, these are the things that they really did well, that they really grew in, but these are the areas where, yeah, they didn't get any better than when they first came to me, or they really weren't able to perform in this particular aspect as I had hoped. That allows us to focus our work and our change on that area. One tool for that is being able to have rubrics that help assess student learnings. It's not the only way to go about it, but it's just an example. then this is the part, the professional analysis. This is the part that's really tricky when we talk about in that cycle of try, fail, reflect. What areas that they fell short were impacted by what things? And as you start that reflection, very often the things that impact student learning are not within our control. Well, they have this and they have that, and this, that they didn't come prepared in this area. And so then the question becomes, what areas that were impacted can we change? What are the variables that we can impact? In some cases, this has led institutions to have food pantries. In some areas, it's led to institutions to have clothes closets, and others to have washing and drying facilities for folks that don't have access to laundry resources. So it can be those types of things that impact student learning, or it can be realizing that we've skipped the scaffolding steps in a process, that we've expected students to perform a certain skill, but we never gave them the tools of what we mean by that school. So how you break that down and think about that is an imperfect science. It's an important part of the process, but it is an imperfect science. And so we ask ourselves, how can I improve the process? So what can I do differently? What can I change? What can I adjust that would potentially, based on my analysis, improve student learning? And then we have to be willing, again, to be vulnerable and ask, did it work? Sometimes we have the most brilliant ideas and lessons and activities, and when we evaluate the student's experience or student learning at the back end of it, it just didn't hit the things that we thought it would. And sometimes we have a thing that we really didn't think was going to be all that spectacular that just really allowed things to click for students and the light bulbs to come on. So that's the end/beginning of the process, is to honestly evaluate, did it work? And that's where the assessment of student learning comes into play, and then moving forward into that reassess cycle. So when we take this perspective and we center our why at the heart of our decision making, we put student learning in that next tier, that shapes the what. It shapes how we approach student learning assessment. It shapes all of the different learning and instructional pieces that can go into this realm. It does require us to be willing to challenge assumptions and question assumptions and challenge what is normal for us by embracing that questioning and that inquisitive why. Some of the things that can happen through this process include program or course redesign. So if we anchor in student learning, if student learning drives the course and the program, we may be prompted to ask what course changes could better support their learning. It could be a lot of work. So there's a lot of reason for us not to want to ask these questions, but it could really enhance student learning. Bear with me for just a moment while I move some of the things on my screen that are blocking my ability to see. Okay. Similarly, the focus on learning outcomes can lead to small micro changes in a classroom, but they can lead to macro changes in an institutional structure. For example, exploration of 8-week terms. And does a program want to make a full conversion? Does an institution want to make a full conversion? Does a weekend college structure want to go to 8-week terms? So thinking differently about the structure of how we time things by being willing to ask the question, if student learning drives the course, is there anything magical about the way we've always done it? Or thinking differently about this, could there be benefits? Could there be positive outcomes for thinking about framing differently? Uh-oh. Okay. Similarly, it could be that as we explore if student learning drives the courses and the programs, is there anything magical about this textbook that I love, and it's been fantastic and it's familiar, and I think the author does a really good job, but it costs $350 for students. Is there anything magical about it? Or could we save our students millions of dollars by shifting how we provide their learning materials. Would that be a way that we can impact those things that otherwise are outside of our reach? When we think about pathways or student and faculty engagement, or students' completion of the degrees or the certificates, the credentials that they started with us for, and student learning drives student experience, then are there challenges, are there barriers that we inadvertently build into the process that we can rethink, that we can approach differently? One example, and this was the heart of the drop rate improvement program, we have a tradition in higher education of recommending to students who are struggling in a course that they should withdraw, that they should drop. Perhaps when we do that, we microphone or we echo the voices that are already in their heads telling them that they're not meant for college. And what happens in the data is that not only do they drop the class, but often they drop out of college. So can we instead engage with and connect with every single student, know them each by name, and affirm for every single one of them, regardless of their performance and what we perceive as their efforts, that they can do this, that they should stick with it, that they can keep trying, that if they don't give up, you won't give up, even if that means that they earn an F, because that perhaps is part of the try, fail, reflect process that we talked about. And so thinking about those things differently. When you approach student learning outcomes, and student learning outcome assessment from this approach and this why and how of student learning, then the culture shift of that drives you to excellence, and compliance with all of those other things simply becomes a byproduct. Because we do what we do because we're passionately committed to our students. And then the documentation is simply how you capture your story. So again, just to recap some of the things, you start with your why, you factor in the collective why of all of you on the team. And then when you identify that the how is anchored around student learning, and student learning assessment then becomes translated into the questions you see in front of you. When you put that at the heart of all that you do, and you put these processes and these ways of thinking about, reflecting on, analyzing, changing, and then assessing again, the work that we do, you are in a position to be able to be asking about transformative possibilities. You may come to questions that others haven't even proposed yet, because you're building a culture of we try, we get an honest picture of where we are, we make an adjustment based on our professional expertise, and then we get an honest picture of where we are again. And so when you do that, you truly take the opportunity to make learning outcome assessment a structural, a cultural, a passionate part of what you do. And the documentation process becomes simply the way that you capture that, as opposed to the driving force. So thank you so much for bearing with the technology and for your thinking on things. I do want to be able to take a break now and stop and pause and see if there are questions before we go on our first formal break of the morning.
Any questions? No? Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions right now. Y'all want to come up and ask any questions? Okay, so let's have a 15-minute break and come back at 9:45. Thank you, Valerie.
My pleasure.
fine. She's available during those breaks. Okay, you ready to start, Valerie?
I am.
Okay.
All right. Are we good on sound? And does everybody have the Designing PLOs slide visible? Thumbs up. All right. Beautiful. So before I step into the designing the PLOs and the SLOs, and I'll try not to lean back away from the microphone like that. But before we step into that, just as a framing reminder, as we shift from moving from the whys that we were talking about, the why for this work really comes down to the first question: are we doing all that we're able to do for our students in higher education? And if the answer is yes, then there's no reason to change. There's no reason to do anything differently than we've always done. But I think if we look at the data, the answer is not yes. And when we look at history, we are really forced to recognize that most of us in the room, whether we're here virtually or live and in person, may not have been the people for whom higher education was originally designed. And it's very important that we take an honest look at higher education wasn't designed for folks that were not wealthy. There were gender exclusions, there were race exclusions, there continue to be exclusions internationally of who is higher education for. So when we look at the performance metrics for our students who come from what we now call underserved, underrepresented, marginalized, there's all kinds of terms for it, but it's ultimately those areas of us, those areas of the human species that higher education's original design was not for. And in the community colleges, that may be working adults, non-traditionally aged students, people pursuing careers that were not inclusive of a university education. So if we're seeking to reach students that the traditional structure did not seek, and we are wanting to be effective and allow success for students that the traditional structure dismissed, then there has to be some way for us to explore how we think differently about our work. And so that is the framing through which I encourage us to approach this question of learning outcomes. And so when you're looking at program learning outcomes, you should start from the frameworks. Consider why students should go through your program. And some of you thought about that with your own why. And that's a great starting point for it. But why should students go through your program? Additionally, why should employers want graduates of your program? It's got to be more than just proximity. What is it that your students will bring to an employer, will bring to their next team because of their experience with you that will make them different from other folks, will make them different from people who came up through industry, or make them different from people who've come from other schools and other programs? And then for the transfer programs and the transfer students, consider why should those universities want your students? What is it that they're going to have or do or be or think that will make them stand out and make them an invaluable contribution to that university? So why should universities want your students? And when you frame your program learning outcomes from those perspectives, then you're really going to be getting at the heart of this work. So when students complete this program, they will be able to, and that doesn't mean this is the exact language that you have to use. And I know in your practices, the they will is the end of the beginning framework. But thinking about program learning outcomes are designed to answer that question. When our students complete this program, they will be able to do what? And it often is our first jarring experience when we initially may answer that question of, well, they'll know how to do this, or they'll know this, or they'll understand. Knowledge and understanding are difficult to see and demonstrate, prove, however you want to think about it. So what is it they will actually be able to do with that knowledge? To use my recent experience, we all know the cliche, turn around, don't drown. We know it. We have that knowledge. The knowledge campaign has been fantastic. And there's apparently a disconnect because one of the two fatalities yesterday was a gentleman who stopped at the water and accelerated to drive his van into 8 foot of water because he felt like he could make it. That is a horrible example of what the gap is between our actions and our knowledge. But we see it over and over and over again. And so when we're framing learning outcomes, we really want to think about the actions, the skills, the behaviors, the things that play out that we will expect our students to then be able to demonstrate and do, not just the knowledge that will sit within their minds. And so we'll talk just a minute about verbs and blooms and all of that, but that's the background behind why your verb choice matters, because understanding something does not mean you behave any differently. Knowing something does not mean you demonstrate it any differently. And what we really want to be thinking about is what behaviors will students be able to demonstrate as part of their transformation with us through these programs. So, for an example, because I felt pretty confident that you do not currently have a safari wildlife management degree, we're going to use that as our example. So if you have a safari wildlife management degree, which I personally think would be awesome, then your first challenge would be to craft your program learning outcomes. What am I going to expect students to be able to do when they complete my safari wildlife management degree? So my program learning outcome 1 might be design protection plans for safari wildlife. Very simple, very straightforward. There's one magical verb, and it's something that I can see, that they can demonstrate. That's a behavior that they would be able to produce. But it's much more complex than can be done in one class. So what I mean by that will go into perhaps a rubric or any number of other assessment tools, but what it means to design a protection plan for safari wildlife will require a whole lot of knowledge, experience, practice, trial, error, all of those things. But ultimately, that's the thing that they would be able to do at a level of mastery, would be my hope. On the inverse, you don't want to use the statement below it. At the end of the safari wildlife management degree, students who complete this program will be able to understand how to design, create, build, repair fences, barriers, moats, and repellent systems for giraffes, lions, elephants, and other animals. Wow, that's a lot. And if you choose that type of approach, every single one of those verbs will require a different level of assessment because it's a different thing that you have said that students will be able to demonstrate. And then it will have to also encompass all of those pieces. So you actually can capture all of the complexity that goes into that with the statement above it. And so the mechanical part of this process, that is the choice of language to frame your program learning outcomes, is its own challenge, because the goal is to really have a laser focus, but in a way that allows the depth of at least 2 years, in the case of a full degree program, of learning that students put into it. So for my safari wildlife management degree, I'm not going to have a 3-line multi-verb statement, but I'm instead going to have a very narrowly focused learning outcome that captures what is going to take multiple courses of learning for students to be able to demonstrate. Similarly, when I then want to move to the next level and say, okay, well, for my student learning outcomes though, at the course level, it's going to shift a little bit within the same context. So when students complete this course, they will be able to do what? So as I think about those, I have to think in the same types of ways about the verbs, and the same types of ways about capturing the complexity of what I want them to be able to get out of this. And I might perhaps say that students will be able to install effective natural barriers to keep elephants out of farms. This, and I'll come back to that slide, this is real. So this is it. This is the physical outcome. This is the artifact of that learning outcome, currently at play in a number of African countries where it's a real problem. And it's a complex problem. And it's a thing that people have tried and failed and reevaluated and tried again. The cost of failure has been elephants being shot by farmers as the tension between humans and animals continues over space. But this is it. And you think, well, how is that a fence? Well, because of all of the learning that went into the experience, this real world experience, what they realized is we can't use conventional fencing materials because they're elephants, right? They're massive. They knock over trees. We're not going to be able to put up walls sufficient. So they had to push for critical thinking. They had to push through trial, error, reevaluation. And what they came to was realizing that elephants really hate bees. They hate bees. I can't blame them. I'm not a big fan of being stung myself. So how is that going to help us? Well, if we have beehives, we can generate honey. That's a positive thing for a family or for a community to be able to produce and sell. And if we string these beehives with wire that's affordable and accessible, and we can maintain it around our farm, then when elephants bump the wire, they shake the beehive, they rattle loose the bees, and the elephants very quickly, because we know they're intelligent animals, understand I'm not going there because the bees come out when I go into that space. And so literally the fencing solution has gone through this whole process and is just, I think, a fantastic example of what can be captured in this. The reality of our potential in this is so important because I know it takes time and it takes work and it can feel disconnected from our students' experience to have to go through these creation processes. But literally, if we don't identify what is it we want them to learn, we can, and we have throughout history in higher education and in K-12, if we're honest, spin our wheels on minutia and lose sight of what is it we really want them to be able to do differently in the world when they leave our classroom. And so thinking about it, remembering that real world application and what is it that we genuinely want them to be able to contribute differently is an important part of this. So similarly, if you're thinking about general education learning outcomes, you heard me reference critical thinking. And so if critical thinking is an important part of the students that come through our doors, then tasks like this, projects like this, learning experiences like this can be built in such a way as to encourage, develop, and teach those skills. So we've developed our program learning outcomes to say what students of our wildlife program will be able to do. We've had an example of for Wild 101, Intro to Herbivore Fencing. We have an idea of a learning outcome, a student learning outcome at the course level that would then help build into that. I believe you have handouts, or you have had handouts about Bloom's learning outcomes. I do not expect you to be able to read these, but Google is a wonderful thing, or any other search browser. The Bloom's taxonomy, the connection between the verbs that we choose and the learning and the skills that those align with is an important part of the language choice that goes into this process. If what we build into our course level experiences and then ultimately then through 20 different courses into our program experiences all lives in the knowledge and understanding, then that's not bad, but is it our full potential? Is it what best prepares our students for the world outside of our classroom or outside of our college? Whereas when we shift and we say, you know, I want them to have knowledge and I want them to understand these things, but I also want them to move beyond that. I want them to apply that learning in tangible ways. I want them to be able to evaluate the different choices. To go back to my elephant fence, shooting an elephant who's walking into your garden is a way to protect your garden. It fulfills the core task. But is it the best way? Is it the right way? Is it the way that is most conducive to a healthy, balanced ecosystem? So do I have the tools to evaluate that choice? I would say that the evaluation tools, as well as the creation tools, are things that are ever more critical in our society as we become more globally connected, as politics face challenges that they did not experience before the current technology has evolved. As we have 15-year-olds, like our little Swedish friend, talking about the environmental and climate challenges that are going to be facing the youngest generation, we're going to need our students in whichever industry or field they're going into to be able to evaluate the choices in front of them and create solutions that go far beyond simply being able to understand what other people have given them as knowledge. So that's really the magnitude of the work that you're dealing with in this area. And as I pointed out, you can thank an English teacher. All of a sudden, all of those classes on verbs may have a different meaning and relevance. So thank the English teacher in your room, and thank the education teacher for the Bloom's taxonomy and the magnitude of impact that can have. But really being intentional about the language choice in this area pushes us to make sure our students are ultimately prepared to perform at the level that we need them to. So for example, if you say that students will be able to evaluate something and create something, and I say, that's wonderful, that is fantastic, your area is just ripe for that, that makes total sense, how are you going to know that? And what you tell me is they're going to take a multiple choice test. I will challenge that most likely the multiple choice test will gauge their knowledge and understanding. It will not be a means through which they can show you their evaluation and creation skills. Are there exceptions? Absolutely. But the vast majority of the time, that's simply not going to be the artifact. That's not going to be the way in which students can demonstrate their evaluation abilities and their creation abilities. Whereas if you have them produce a production, if you have them craft a paper, if you have them develop a sales pitch for that approach, there's various other ways that the student demonstration of their learning allows them to reflect their evaluation and their creation skills. So that the verb choice that you have is integrally tied to the artifact or the ultimate series of assignments or capstone assignment or experience that you will ask them to do. So it really gives us a framework of how are we going to approach our class, and then ultimately how are we going to approach our programs. And so that's having those questions and thinking about the course design and the program design from that perspective is what can trigger transformations or changes or reframing in ways that otherwise simply wouldn't be as likely to come forward. Another example, in a program that went through this process was criminal justice. And in their process, they realized that the outcome, the student learning behaviors at the end were really complex and couldn't be captured effectively for them in a paper. So what they decided to do was have a capstone experience where they ran through fully developed crime scenes with moulage and all of that. And they had to actually work through that part of the project, of the process of what they were being trained to do. And then in another class, they ran a full courtroom scenario where they had to experience the types of questioning and evidence and all of those pieces. And so the framing, when they realized these are the outcomes we want our students to be able to do, required them to design their courses differently. And then similarly, triggered them to rethink, well, if this is our program outcome and we have not actually ever brought it into the dialogue until the very end, maybe we need to change the structure of the program to better support those learning outcomes. So I want to make sure that there's an opportunity for any questions before we move to the breakout, and I can also go back to any of those pieces. But your key parts of designing those program learning outcomes and the student learning outcomes is making sure to think about the skills, the behavior, the demonstrated capabilities that students will be able to do after the program, after the course, as well as how to then capture and articulate that in the most concise way that captures all of the work that will build up to that ultimate point. There will be an activity for you in just a moment that I think the team there on the ground is going to help facilitate for you to be able to look at your own program learning outcomes and go through either a design of a new one or a revision of an existing one. And I believe there was a discussion that you may have one that would be advised for you to revise or explore or think about. But before we do the individual application, and please note, we've talked, now you're applying the knowledge. So this learning pattern is part of how we as humans process, not just this thing we do to other people. So any questions that folks have, either via chat or through the microphone before we break out to do that work?
Valerie, I'm at the microphone. This is Brenda.
Hey, Brenda.
So I am just looking around to see if anybody has any questions before we kind of explain what they're going to do at their tables. Anybody have any questions? Everybody knows how you're grouped already at your tables with your programs. So you're going to kind of work together on this. And you have at your table a form that looks like this. Does everybody see this? For each program. And on this sheet, and we're going to talk about the top part a little bit later, but it's our kind of proposed institutional learning outcomes at the top. At the bottom are your current program learning outcomes. And I know that some of you have already begun a revision process on your program learning outcomes, which is awesome. But I want you to go ahead and look at those program learning outcomes. You also have a sheet that looks like this. Does everybody see this one? There's a sheet like this, and we're just looking at this side of this paper for right now. And on it gives you an opportunity on the right-hand side to write or revise a program learning outcome. So on the right-hand side, there's a blank that it says program learning outcomes. It has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it doesn't have anything written on it. And you can use that sheet of paper to kind of start your revision process. You also have a Bloom's action words, verbs for Bloom's revised taxonomy at your tables. Raise your hand if you do not find those things at your table. What are you missing? This one? So for those of you in Associate of Arts and Associate of Science, those are program learning outcomes that certain people already have. So who has the program for Associate of Arts? Who has that one? Okay, you guys both have that. And then, okay, they're taking it to you. Associate of Science, who has that form? You guys have it. So you guys will be working on that together, kind of thing. Any questions about what you're going to do? You're going to try to look at your program learning outcomes, see if there's one that you can practice revising. That's just all we're going to do right now.
Okay, you've had some discussion at your tables about your first program learning outcome, and we're going to go into the next session. So Valerie's going to start again.
All right. So, do we have sound again? Get a thumbs up from somebody in the audience. We have audio? Yes, no?
Maybe we need to turn it up a bit.
Okay. How about now? Do we have thumbs up from somebody in the audience that you're able to hear me? Anyone? I'm gonna do the Ferris Bueller. Anyone? Anyone? Are we good?
Valerie, I think they're enjoying this discussion so much, but I think we're gathering back together and can hear you great.
Okay. Well, that is good. I hate to be the one to interrupt awesome learning discussion. So let me just add the next piece, because we will certainly put you back together to continue your discussion. But I think this next piece will also help give context for the work that you're doing and how that piece of the program learning outcomes fits into the bigger question as well. So curriculum mapping starts to look at how do we actually ensure that students are learning these things that we've identified. So we've asked the question, what will students learn to do in the program? What will students learn to do in a course? And those are very important. So those are your PLOs for your overall framework, and then your SLOs for at the course level. But then we have to ask ourselves the question, how will they actually learn what they need for the program? And that's where we come to IRM mapping. So I'll talk about that acronym in just a moment. But the question is the important part in this process, because again, the mechanics or the documenting of the answers is very important as a cataloging, so to speak, of the thinking and the attempts and the effort and the learning that all go into this. Much like when we were talking about the learning outcomes, if the content of our map is the answer to our question, how will they actually learn what they need to know, then we have to also ask ourselves, oh, hang on, I just lost my stuff. All right, we're back. How will we know that our plan has worked? And that's really where assessment comes into play. Assessment is that final snapshot at the end of multiple years of work for students. When we're talking about program learning outcomes, we get a picture at the end of a collection of artifacts or experiences, things that students have done to be able to review and evaluate ourselves to answer the question, did they actually learn what we hoped they would through the program? So IRM, because we cannot be in education without acronyms, we love our acronyms. IRM stands for Introduce, Reinforce, and Mastery. You will encounter, if you talk to colleagues at different institutions, you will encounter different types of acronyms that are all used to reflect the same type of process, where we ask ourselves, where do we introduce the learning outcome that we've identified? Where do we first share it with students? Where do we reinforce it through their experiences? And then where do we capture a picture of it at the end? Your institution has chosen Introduce, Reinforce, and Mastery as the terminology. Some institutions will use assessment, some will use evaluate. There's lots of different ending letters or ending word choices, but I really like your choice to use mastery. I'd like to commend you on that, because when we start to think about gauging students' level of mastery with a skill, I think that puts us in the right frame of mind. When we talk about assess, it just has a different connotation as far as what we're doing in that window. But we understand that students are going to move through a program with different levels of mastery in various aspects and various skill sets. And the question isn't, have we gotten all of our students, have we gotten 100% of our students to have perfection in this skill set? That's not a reasonable expectation. So part of the exploration of mastery really becomes compelling ourselves to define, what do we mean by mastery of a particular outcome? What would that look like? What would the pinnacle of accomplishment at that level look like? And the level is important because a lot of the work that you do may have subsequent degrees or life experience or career experience through which our students continue to develop and improve their proficiency. And that's fantastic. So it's not a question of, are they the most amazing performer of this skill and they have learned everything that they will learn in a lifetime, but rather to be able to understand for ourselves, okay, when they leave this associate's degree, whether it's to go on to transfer or to go into their career directly, when they leave this associate's degree, at what level of mastery do we expect them to be able to perform in each of these skill areas for their next transition, so that they're prepared to be learners in life after Blue Ridge? For me, the analogy that works best in my thinking about this is in the martial arts. So for folks who have not had an opportunity to be in the martial arts, very often from the outside, the idea of a black belt is a snapshot of mastery. That is the person who is the toughest. That is the person who is most experienced. That is the pinnacle of accomplishment. And when I started in the martial arts as an undergraduate and came to understand at the very beginning the tiers, you have yellow, you had orange, you had green, you had red, brown was in there somewhere, and then you had black. I was like, okay, black is it. That is like the pinnacle. And inevitably, as you start and you hit that very first belt, and some of you may have kids who've gone through this process, or you yourself, yellow belt is a really dangerous thing because we know just enough to be dangerous and not enough to be proficient. And so that's really that introduce stage where, aha, I've learned this thing. I've learned how to do this thing, and now I can wreak havoc with it. Not where we want our students to end up, but it is the beginning. It is a necessary first part of that process. What you realize in the martial arts, as you get to that black belt test, the awarding of that belt that others see as the end of your process, if you have had a good teacher, if you have had a good sensei, if you have had a good instructor, then what they tell you is, congratulations, you are now ready to learn. You are now ready to enter the realm of being a student of this art for the rest of your life. And that's really what we are preparing students to be, is in the 2 years or 3 years that we have a student, we are preparing them and giving them the skill set to be a masterful student of that area for the rest of their life. And so setting those parameters of mastery expectations are really important conversation to be able to have with your peers about what is that point for this area, for this learning outcome, for our students upon completion of this program. Oh, sorry, let me go back. So as we think about what can get framed in very learning science heavy language, it's important to me to always be able to articulate it and think about it in much more accessible ways, because that helps us frame it to students. That also helps it make meaning for us. So when we think about introducing, basically what we're saying is there's this thing that you, the student, should know how to do. And that's all we're able to do in the introduction stage, is let them know and identify there's this thing that you should know how to do. When we get to the areas of reinforcement, then we're able to say, remember that thing we talked about? It may have been last semester. It may have been a few weeks ago. How's it going? Show me where you are. Let's see what you can do in that area right now. I don't expect you to be where you will be, but let's check in and let's reinforce what you've learned. Let's remind you of things you may have forgotten. Let's add to your experience and proficiency. It's really that intermediary stage. And then that allows mastery to be, show me what you got. All right, we're at the end of this process. We've got everything developed. You are getting ready to walk across that stage. Show us what you got. So when you think about the introduce stage for your curriculum mapping, the way you ask the questions to guide yourself through this process are what you see on the screen. In which classes do we do this? Do our students take them first? If they don't, what's the impact? And do we need to change something as a result? You're going to see these questions play out at each stage. The second one is a really tricky one. It's the core of Pathways work. It's the bane of all transfer programs at community colleges' existence. And it's a really fair question to ask. When we say that the Intro to Composition English class is where students learn all of the writing and critical thinking skills that they need for all of the rest of their program, but they don't take it first and sometimes they avoid it and take it last, that may not have an easy solution, but it's a really important part of this process. Just because we have said this is an introduce course for this skill doesn't mean students experience it that way. And so we have to think about, well, if they don't take it first, if they don't experience the introduction at the beginning of their time with us, what do we need to adjust? What do we need to change? Do we need to make sure that introduction also happens in these other classes that they are taking first? A chronic question in the technical programs is the general education hours get taken last because we prioritize the workforce credentials and the certifications. There's sound logic to that, but it's problematic if that introduction was supposed to happen before they get into your technical classes and they don't get it until after. And so, much like all questions, I bring that forward for you to explore, to question. There's not a right answer, but the right answer isn't to have a process that doesn't allow us to see where our issues are. So being able to figure out, what are we going to do about that? Sometimes people take that opportunity to look at writing across the curriculum. Sometimes they do team teaching. Sometimes they build pathways where students have to take the introduction courses early on. So there's lots of different ways that institutions and faculty answer these questions. But the first step is, where do we introduce it to our students? Then similarly, we ask ourselves, with the reinforcing of a learning outcome, in which classes does this happen? And do they take it after it's been introduced? Or are we trying to reinforce something that students haven't ever seen before? And how do we gauge the student learning? If you remember, I said just a minute ago, that exchange, how's it going, is your opportunity to touch base with folks. This does not have to be a formal assessment. It is the huge collection of informal assessments, or it is formal assessment to the course that not necessarily submitted anywhere, but otherwise part of your process, where you are gauging student learning at that point. If there's not a way to gauge what they have learned and where they are in that midway point, then only after they get to the end and we realize, oh, they didn't get this piece at all, it's too late in our process for us to pivot and make adjustments. So I encourage you to think about your reinforce courses as opportunities for interdepartmental or interfaculty collaboration, to say, okay, these 3 courses are reinforcement of this skill. How are your students doing? Do they look totally confused? Are they able to do these particular assignments in the way that we expect them to? So even if there's not a formal collection of that information, there is that opportunity for professional dialogue about how are you seeing them do? How is their learning being demonstrated? Do we need to catch people up in a certain aspect of this? Or do we need to go ahead and push forward because this particular group is just really picked these things up quickly and we have an opportunity to advance that area. And then lastly, with the mastery, again, in what classes do we do this? Do students take them after it's been introduced and after it's been reinforced? And this is the point in time where you do formally assess student learning. It is your opportunity to capture a snapshot picture of the cumulative experiences of learning for students in those outcome areas that you've identified as critical for their success, to say, okay, here it is. How do they do? How are they measuring up in the areas that we aspired for them to be able to be proficient or to have mastery? So when you go through this process, it inevitably triggers really valuable questions that are not easy. And so part of our human aversion to this work sometimes is, oh my gosh, this is just a lot. It is a lot. It really is a lot, but it has the ability to make such a big difference. So for example, when I was talking about the criminal justice program, if the realization is, well, they need to be able to experience this crime scene, or they need to be able to experience this courtroom, and the next follow-up is, well, where are we going to do that? Well, we need a space to be able to do that. Okay, well, do we have that space in our facilities? And if not, do we need to have a partnership with the courthouse or a partnership with some of the detectives to be able to make that space available? And is it inside space or is it outside space? So these processes are cumbersome and difficult, sometimes raise questions that are very hard to answer, but they can really open the door for improvements for your students that really result in much more energizing experiences for the faculty as well. As you go through it, if it's approached in a way that is genuine and meaningful, all of this can be done in a box checking way, and we will always get what we've always got. And I believe that you are positioned to be able to do it in a genuine and meaningful way, because you express, you care about the outcomes for your students, and you believe in the transformative power that your programs and your experience has to bring forward. So then looking back at the curriculum mapping, did we skip the introduction or the reinforcement or the mastery? I've worked with a number of faculty through their programs in this process, and inevitably there's a number of programs where when the faculty lay this out, they look at it and they go, we never introduced that. We just had them do it at the end of the program. So we have the mastery part, but we never actually introduced them to the skills that build up to that. And that's a real light bulb moment for faculty. Like, okay, well, where are we going to do that? Which course is the right place for that to morph? And sometimes the answer has been, we don't have one. We need to develop, we need to make a curriculum change that builds a course or that adds a course or that changes a course to be able to provide that. Similarly with the reinforcement. Very often it's the two ends of the spectrum. The I has been skipped completely, or we've nailed the I, but we've forgotten the mastery part. So really taking a look at, did we skip any of these stages that are a natural, necessary progression for student learning? Do we have students practice the skills? So in education jargon, we say scaffolding. Did we have students actually do the pieces and the components that build up to this final skill set? Or did we just throw them in the deep end? Think about any physical activity, any sport, any art, music that you have learned and that you probably don't get thrown into a game or given the sheet of music for your instrument right away. You have to learn, first of all, you just have to learn how to hold the racket if it's tennis, or you have to learn where you stand on the court and don't stand in the wonderful world of offsides. You have to learn pieces and then you build the pieces up to actually being able to apply them in any meaningful way. So have we had students practice those puzzle piece skills that allow them to then demonstrate a more comprehensive outcome at the end? Have we scaffolded their learning throughout the program? So have we given them the time to learn these pieces, and then have we allowed them to practice in multiple iterations those skills? Sometimes what we find when we look at this process and we back up from our programs isn't that we've skipped something necessarily, but sometimes we have beat them over the head with introduce for like 10 courses, and then all of a sudden we're mastering. So really looking at, for either our learning outcome, if we have one learning outcome that shows up in every single course and we're introducing it in 19 of our 20 courses, is that really necessary? Is that beneficial to students learning? Or if we cut back the reiteration of introducing a topic over and over and over and over again, can we make room for new things? To stay with my criminal justice example, in that same program, and I use them as an example because there's a particular group of faculty that just really used and embraced this process to transform their program. And it just was such an energizing team process for them that transformed how they operated and how their students experienced this for years afterwards. So what they realized is that, in fact, they had done this. They had introduced the same topic and they touched on the same topic over and over and over again, to the point that it was beyond what was necessary and beneficial to student learning. When they identified courses in the program that could actually be removed without any detriment to the student learning for that outcome, that allowed them to add courses that acknowledged the newer issues in the criminal justice system, the newer issues, homeland security, of international security, of race discussions and debates in the criminal justice system. All of those things were able to have a place to exist as improvements to the learning outcomes that they were able to identify, because they figured out what could come out without being a detriment to students' learning. And then, hang on one moment because I can't actually see. So yes, so that will allow very holistic exploration of the student learning experiences, possibilities, and allowing to say, well, we can't possibly squeeze any more things in. Maybe not, but do you have things that you can shift, that you can change the emphasis, so that there is space for what it is that is meaningful student experience. This kind of aligns with the idea that when we talk about lecture, right, and we say, I need to cover all 16 chapters, I need to make sure that I give that to them. If we don't do that in a way that students actually learn it, then all we've done is say it. We haven't presented it in a way that students are learning it. So thinking about programs through the same lens. So this leads us to the time when, again, I believe your folks there are going to be able to guide you through applying these concepts and these frameworks for thinking about introduce, reinforce, and mastery, taking your learning outcomes at the course level and the program level, and starting to put that full picture together. So I will hand off the microphone at this point.
Valerie, before you leave, though, I'm going to see if there's any questions before we jump into doing this. Like, for instance, sometimes it's very easy for those who have specific programs to see that mapping process. Yes, let's say for criminal justice or for business or for horticulture or something like that, they can see that mapping process very easily. Could you just help us a little bit with the, let's say, Associate of Arts, Associate of Science, General Education, in knowing how to progress through the IRM chart a little bit.
Absolutely. And the associate in arts and the associate in science are extremely challenging for all kinds of logistical purposes, in part because they were designed at the creation of community colleges not to be standalone programs, but to be the general education for somebody else's program. And so trying to conceptualize, well, what does that mean though for us, is really tricky. So one way to think about it, if the AA or the AS, if we are the program that is to serve the general education function for all kinds of different programs at the baccalaureate level, what's important in that for us? And some states across the country, Texas is one, have identified, well, these are your 6. This is what we tell you is important about that general education completion. But really the starting point is what are those outcomes that, regardless of the focus they're going to take in their baccalaureate work, what are those things that we need them to be masters of to get there? So for example, communications and critical thinking are often somewhere in that process. If students are going to be expected to be masters of critical thinking, where are we going to introduce those first concepts? What do we mean by critical thinking? How do we break that down into its skill sets? And then how does that move through the I, the R, and then ultimately the M? Inevitably, that raises the question of our pathways for transfer students. And we bump our knees kind of on the table that says, well, they can just take whichever classes in whichever sequence. Perhaps that's part of our challenge as community colleges. Should they? Should we sequence it such that there's not quite that much fluidity? Is there something to be learned from the AAS programs about some structure to those pathways? Do we have more choices than is actually beneficial to students? And there's a lot of debate right now about is the variety of choice real, or do students tend to take the same sequence of, what are student patterns in that progression? And the additional challenge for the transfer programs, when we ask that question about critical thinking, very few of us went to school and took classes in critical thinking. Very few of us went to school and took classes in social responsibility is another one for Texas. But so we have to lean on each other to define and understand what is that skill set supposed to look like. And assuming that students come with very little actual experience in that, how do we begin to introduce it and build it throughout? So the interdepartmental conversations become paramount in ways very different from the technical programs. So hopefully that helps a little bit, but also it really is just to validate, it is very difficult because the AA and the AS were not designed in their origins as programs. So now we're trying to conceptualize, yes, but they are. And if so, what are these outcomes that we want everyone who's transferring to be proficient in? And how do we frame their pathway in ways that set them up to be successful in that?
Thank you so much. Those of you who she was specifically talking to, did that help in your think process for this next stage we're going to go into? That interdepartmentally working together is really going to be critical. So this next little exercise that we're going to do is going to be practicing some of that IRM that she has spoken about. So you worked on a program learning outcome just a few minutes ago. And what we want you to do is take that one program learning outcome that you are working on. And you remember this sheet right here? Where you were going to write or revise your program learning outcomes, and you're just going to do one, or if you, some of you may have moved on to more than one. On the back side of it has an example of what our IRM looks like. And eventually we do have this in electronic format. so that it's going to be an electronic version for you to be working in. And so real quick, I'm just going to show you that electronic version so you can know where you're going with this. And if I can find the right, Jason can help me find the right thing here. I think we're right here. I shared with all of you a Google link to a folder. And I just replied this morning to the email that Kathy sent out about this Zoom link. And in that, I gave you another link that goes to a folder that's called Assessment Documents, All Programs. So the things that we've been using today are in that folder. You can see the different things that we have been using today that are in there, as well as another folder that says PLO Maps. And that's our curriculum maps. And each program has their own curriculum map in there. And so all of you have access to that. So we're practicing on this sheet if you want. And I'm just going to very quickly show you an example of what it might look like filled out. But first, let me just show you what the blank one looks like. On the first page is just directions, and it has our institutional learning outcomes listed for you. And then IRM, the I is introduced, the R is reinforced, the M is master, as Valerie has so wonderfully explained to us. And then down here where it says program learning outcomes, you'll actually click on that and actually type in your program learning outcome. So if you're just wanting to do this electronically in your practice time and you want to just type in that one program learning outcome that you've already practiced putting together, you can. And then when you go to the PLO map, the next tab over, you'll see that we're going to try to map from our institutional learning outcomes to our program learning outcomes, whether or not it's an IRM and the course that you're going to be using, the course activity that you'll use, and then, let's scroll over here, how it ties also into your course student learning outcomes. If we're doing things in our courses that doesn't really tie to a course student learning outcome, should we be doing them? So this is kind of what it looks like. Now I'm going to show you one that is filled out to give you an example. Does anybody have any questions on this first? Just kind of how it's going to be, the sequence of it. So one that we've started filling out, can you guess which one it might be? Early childhood. So we put in our program learning outcomes down here at the bottom. We go to our curriculum map, and Jason has done a great job, so he's color-coded this for us. So we started out with our first program learning outcome, and it's just a drop down. Now that I have all of them in there, you can just choose your program learning outcome that you're going to do right there. And then the I, of course, is our introduce. And we've kind of written out what course that we use that introduction in, what activity we're doing, and how it ties to our student learning outcome for that course. When you scroll on down, you'll see that we started then, here's where we reinforce it. And we're reinforcing that same program learning outcome and reinforcing it in different courses with different course activities, and then how it ties to those course student learning outcomes. And then as you scroll on down, and we don't have as many under mastery, but you can see it's the same program learning outcome. We're in the mastery part. They're at the end of their program, and they're doing some major things there. And then we just started going on down to the next program learning outcome. And then how does it tie to an institutional learning outcome? And you can tie it into the institutional learning outcomes as well. But for right now, you're just going to practice on one program learning outcome and figure out where you might introduce that, where you reinforce it, and where you master it. So thinking through that process for just one program learning outcome. I'm going to turn to Jason to see if he has anything else he wants to share about this.
Just make sure that on your directions page, that when you guys are typing it in, you'll put in your outcome here so that it can pull in over here automatically. It'll do that for you. Don't go up here like, I want to change I to be something else, or art. No, because that affects everything else over here. So the goal is, our long-term goal is to actually get this into SharePoint. Amy Williford's working on a new form so that when we can push this information up so you guys won't have to retype it in there. The nice thing is, when we have this in there, you'll be able to pull customized reports that you only see what you want to see. So we're trying to get this in an easiest way possible so that she can upload it and we can start pulling the kind of stuff that's important for you. So that's if you're like, I don't really like those colors. Why is there not a unicorn? I want an unhappy face. Tough luck. That's what's coming with the SharePoint. We can do that there. So this is just an easy form to start that process so we can start collecting that data to input. And if you're like, I don't want to break it, then just use the piece of paper. Start off with that.
Start off with the paper. All right, questions?
Brenda, could I add one more thing?
Steve will now sing a song.
Valerie, did you want to say something?
Could I please?
Yes.
First of all, I want an unhappy face on my unicorn is going to be my first request. But for the folks tackling the AA or the AS, you may want to approach this from how are students currently experiencing the program. And it may look like a whole bunch of popcorn with arrows all over the place. And how do we want students to experience the program? Because if you can put the 2 points of your continuum, then you start asking the questions, well, how do we start to get them closer and closer to the ideal progression through a program? You have certain areas that have prerequisite courses. So the sciences, math, and English can be really good about that. And that helps to give you fixed points in the introduction, reinforcement, and mastery. But it may be helpful to take that approach. How are students currently experiencing the transfer course programs or transfer programs? How do we want them to experience the transfer programs? And then be able to start having conversations about, well, how do we get closer and closer to that ideal? The other point that I was going to make, as you're aligning your courses with your program learning outcomes, not every course has to have every program learning outcome, of course. However, every course should align with at least one of your program learning outcomes. If you have a course that has no program learning outcome to run around with, then you either have to add and think about, have I missed an important part of my program and I need to add a learning outcome? Or is this course one that really no longer fits the program? And even if I really love that discipline topic, does it need to go? So every course should contribute to the program learning outcomes. I mean, if it doesn't, you want to explore the two ends of that possibility as well. And I will continue to be here if folks have questions they want to come up to the computer for while you're working.
Steve has a comment or question. Let's see.
So we have a program that has multiple pathways. So just to confirm, I guess our program learning outcomes that they would encompass all the pathways, or would we, should we have individual programming learning outcomes that are more focused or more clearly linked to a certain technical pathway?
Okay, so Valerie, let's make sure. So that was information technology.
Mm-hmm.
I have different pathways under information technology.
So students may approach the ultimate degree completion by focusing on different certifications on the front end.
Correct.
Okay. So there's a couple different ways to approach that. One is to put yourself in the perspective of, and this applies for everybody, but your experience is a great combination of both the technical sequencing and the fluidity that can be in the transfer programs. So put yourselves in the shoes of a student. Say, okay, how can a student experience this program? And organizationally, you all can make choices as to, do you only capture one of these or do you capture all of them? But if you map each of the ways that a student would experience the program, then you're able to get a picture of, okay, if we introduce it in the Cisco course here, if I've come at it from a different certification, do I have an introduction in that one as well? So regardless of my pathway, am I getting that introduction, reinforcement, and mastery in parallel ways, or does it get skipped? Does anything get skipped in the introduction because I've started from a certificate different from one of the other pathways? So what I would recommend is that you at least talk through and think through each of the ways that a student can experience the entire degree, and then look for the continuity or the breaks in continuity for the student experience of introduction, reinforce, and assess. And sometimes what we see in that is that if they go this route, they've missed what we built into this other route.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else have a general question for Valerie that she could answer for us? I'm making her walk up here.
Okay.
Debbie DeWitt.
Okay, college transfer. I think we do a really good job with the I and the R, but where does the M happen? Does it happen when they transfer to a four-year school, or does it happen here?
Very good question. In design, if you are able to build it into their experience there, that would be the goal. What we know is that students don't always complete the degree before they transfer, and so they may miss some of that mastery point, and that's okay. I think it captures exactly why it is beneficial for students to complete the degree before transferring, is they get all the way to that final point. What can be tricky is figuring out what serves the parallel of a capstone experience or a mastery point of experience when the pathways for a transfer student can be so fluid. What you can look at look for first is which courses have the longest sequence of prerequisites, because it organically compels that later in the program. So for example, if a literature course requires that they take the first and second semester of English before they take the literature course, that may lend itself to be a great capstone course for a number of program learning outcomes. Similarly, in the AS, if that's Calculus 2, then that has that kind of compulsion towards the end of a program, then does that single course create a capstone experience opportunity? Different programs are set up such that a single course can very legitimately assess mastery on a number of program learning outcomes if it's approached from that perspective of a capstone experience. Again, it's not going to be a test, it's not going to be that type of thing, but it can be an internship or a co-op or clinical setting. I mean, all of those types of very real applications of the entire program's learning can be captured. So in the transfer programs, looking for where are those courses that we've already got a compulsory push toward the end of their experience, but you do want to capture their mastery at the point of completion with you, because again, just like preparing for the workforce, you're trying to get that understanding of when they leave us, we expect that they can perform at this level so that they're prepared as good learners for the next level.
Thank you, Valerie. Mm-hmm. A lot of students that get to that level of, let's say that literature course, not all students take that, but that's okay.
Absolutely. And that's an important part of this. We're going to think about it from the student experience perspective, but we're not assessing an individual student. What we're looking at is, how is our program built so that the students who move through the whole program are able to have these concepts introduced, reinforced, and then ultimately have the mastery on these critical things. And so it is a very important shifting that we do in this process, that we build it for the student in mind, but we're assessing, is the program built to create this mastery for our students? And it is okay. Similarly, sometimes people get anxious. Well, what if a student doesn't do that assignment? Then you don't have a picture of, has that student mastered it? And that's handled on an individual basis. But for the sake of program learning outcome assessment, it's not a variable. Now, if no students take the course where you're trying to capture that information, that's a different logistical problem. But it is a little bit of a shift back and forth, that you build with the student in mind, but then you're assessing the program. So for the students who come to the end of the program and are completing and demonstrate their level of mastery in the outcomes that we've identified, where do they fall? Are they where we expect them to be? And so that's a really good point. It's a movement between, we build it for the individual student, but what we're measuring is how is our program doing in supporting the students in this process?